Boom! We share our time and space today with Rob Hopkins, the one and only figure and founder of the Transition Town movement that is now international, started in 2005 in Totnes in England. And sorry for the French speakers, you could see we're going to do in English, of course. Mais la bonne nouvelle, c'est qu'on va enchaîner cette conversation avec une autre, et celle de Noémie Cheval, qui est elle la responsable du réseau en transition Romandie, pour voir un peu les implications des idées de Rob plus localement. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment. That will help us a lot, and enjoy the show. All right, we are live with Rob Hopkins. Thank you so much for coming in Switzerland.
My absolute pleasure. Lovely. Thanks for inviting me on.
So if I understand well, you're doing an international tour, or what's the reason for your presence in our country?
Beautiful nation. So the Swiss Romand Transition Hub have been trying to get me here for about 3 years, and every time we had it arranged, COVID would come back and COVID would come again. So I think we tried 2 or 3 times to find dates, and we had them in the diary, and then, oh no, we have to cancel again. So we did some things online, and then that was okay, but it wasn't quite the same. So this is finally the much postponed tour. So I do, this is part of a bigger, I was in France, then I've come here, then I'm going to Germany, then I'm away for about 3 weeks.
Wow.
Just traveling around, and then I'm going back to France again. So it's really nice after COVID to be able to do all of that again, to meet people and do talks to real people where you can see their legs and that kind of stuff, you know.
Yeah, COVID forced us to kind of hibernate for some times. I don't know if you felt it, but I'm involved also in transition project. We'll talk about it later, and it had like a quite chilling effect actually, because meeting together like in presence physically is also what energize and allow us to, you know, feel that we're not alone and stuff. So the moral the motivation took a toll, I think, with this virus. I don't know what you yourself.
Well, I felt like the very beginning, the first lockdown, is something that I remember really fondly. It was the most beautiful spring I think we ever had, and we couldn't go to work. So we stayed at home and didn't have anything to do because all of our work was cancelled. By the second and third lockdown, all our work had moved online, and we were probably working harder than we did before COVID. But that first lockdown had all disappeared, and there was this amazing, it was about a month or something, where there was this incredible, the streets were really quiet, there were no planes, the air smelt really nice, it was an amazing spring. People were really looking out for each other, neighbors looking out for each other. And there was this amazing sort of flowering online of people doing really creative, or like families learning whole dance sequences, and people making themselves look like old masters, paintings, and people writing that novel they'd always wanted to write. And by the third lockdown, everyone was sick of the whole thing.
I think so,
but it was, but actually, I think you're right about transition, because so much of the way the transition movement works is about getting real people into a room, facilitating it in a way that then you get these serendipitous kind of meetings with different people. And that's been a real struggle to do that. And Zoom just doesn't come close. It can't really facilitate that. Some aspects of Zoom some aspects of transition moved on to Zoom and did okay. But I think we're still really sort of waiting to see the degree to which it can bounce back after 2 years of everyone being shut away, you know. Yeah.
As I said earlier, you founded, I don't know how we can say that, you created, you thought, you imagine the transition town in 2005, maybe even earlier. And in your talks and appearance, you say, you take the quote, "Everything great that ever happened in this world happened first in someone's imagination." That's from Astrid Lindgren. And my question is, what was in your imagination before 2005, before you started actually this all worldwide experience now? Was it that wide. I'm going to do something that's spread everywhere. What was in your mind?
Not at all, not at all. What was in my mind then was that I was a permaculture teacher, and I lived in Ireland, and I was part of a group of people who were trying to build an eco-village project there. So at that stage, what was in my imagination was about creating kind of living, breathing, physical examples of sustainability that people could come and see and interact with, and that could be used then to teach and inspire people. So in a college in a town called Kinsale, we created the first 2-year full-time permaculture course in the world at that stage, which is still running now, 21 years later. Make me feel very old. But it was, so that was really my interest, was about like practical sustainability and creating. So we did a lot of cob building, straw bale building, clay plasters, trying to build warm, beautiful homes using local materials, building with straw bales and stuff like that, creating permaculture gardens. So for me, it was very much that idea of we need to get land, build examples. So that was what was in my imagination really at that time. And then around in October 2004, so after we'd spent a long time trying to find land to do this eco-village project, get planning permission to do this eco-village project, and then we had started building, and the house that I was building, that was a cob house with local timber and local stone and things, which was 2/3 finished. Hundreds of volunteers had come and worked on it. Someone set it on fire. We had like an arson attack on this house that we were building, and it threw everything completely up in the air. You know, this house was a kind of a culmination of a 10-year dream of my family, that we were going to build this house, live in it as part of this eco-village we'd been developing. We could use it for training and for courses, and that would be our work, and it was where our children were growing up. Everything just was put up in the air. And then that was also around the time when I really understood climate change. I had my kind of climate change dark night of the soul, you know, when it really settles into you and you think,
is it?
Jesus, oh my God.
Okay. Why did you read a book or watch like a documentary or just studies and you just
I read a
like
book,
synced in?
I think I read a book. I can't remember what it was, but it was, yeah. And so then it's triggered this whole kind of train of thought in me of thinking, okay, we bought this land. We were building this house. We've got food gardens in place. We've got firewood planted. We've got our own well. What am I going to do if the town down the road runs out of energy, runs out of food? You know, am I prepared in this little bubble I've made of kind of a degree of self-sufficiency, although less self-sufficiency than I would like to think it was? Would I be prepared to defend this? If everybody in the village was cold and didn't have enough food, and I'm sitting here with all my firewood and my garden full of food, am I prepared to defend this?
That's the thought of survival. Like,
exactly. So there are people, survivalists, who would say, yes, of course, you defend it. For me, I'm like, no, I wouldn't defend this with a rifle, because either this is a crisis that either we all find a way through together, or I don't want to be living in a cave up a mountain with 4 years worth of baked beans and toilet roll and small firearms. That's not my idea of how. I'd rather not be here, frankly. So actually, it was where some of the seeds and the imaginings of transition came from. Was we need to do all of this together. We need to figure out the ways that we can take all of the stuff we've learned here about growing and gardening and building more energy efficient ways and local materials and local economics. But we have to take it into the towns and take it into the cities and take it into the communities, because they need it. We all need it. We need to do this together.
Is it also linked this way of thinking? Because I've looked a little bit on your bio. And after you were 12, maybe a little bit older, you went to Italy in a Buddhist monastery or something like that. And then you went to India, Pakistan, China, or maybe I'm misleading, but other countries. And so at one point, and that was the same for me, that's why I'm inquiring, these differences of culture always help, like open many windows of my actually, because when I was 18 or 19, I went to Canada to learn English, and then I went to Mexico, and this completely changed my perception of the world and the people living in the world. But you've done so many different cultures. Do you think that helped you in some points to connect to this feeling of it's either we all together or it's not worthy? Because I have the same actually perception of the crisis. I don't see the point of fighting for survival. I'd rather die.
Yeah, exactly.
Trying to make like a life that is
exactly
healthy, happy, and with dignity.
Exactly. Yeah, beautifully put. I think for me, I was 18, and like you say, I went to live in Tuscany, in this amazing.
It's crazy. Tuscany
Buddhist
is
place.
so amazing. I went camping this summer, so I'm just like having it in my head there. It's so beautiful.
It's so beautiful. And I arrived there, I was 18. I was a bit lost. I didn't really know what I was doing. And then I went to this place because a friend of mine had gone there before and told me it was really good. And the only reason I went there originally was because it was a way to stay out of England. I was so disillusioned with the UK and just fed up with it.
What about the food, though? Because the English food is not very well known compared to the Italian one. And if I go to Tuscany, it's quite exclusively for the good food.
It's for the good food. Well, I mean, it was a whole package, really. Yeah. Food, sunshine, beautiful place. And I went there. It was, yeah, like I say, I was 18. I was a bit lost. I didn't really know what I was doing. And I arrived there, and it was a big place. It was like, it was, if it was a hotel, it would sleep about 140 people. Like when they had big courses and they needed to accommodate people in bedrooms and dormitories and stuff, about 140 people. So I arrived, and the way it worked at that time was that if you worked, then your work covered your food and a place to stay. I thought, that's perfect. That'll do me. I can stay here. And so I said, so what do you want me to do? What work do you want me to do? They said, oh, this guy here, he's Alessandro, and he's the house manager, and work with him. So I was working with him for a couple of weeks, learning how to do all the laundry and clean the rooms and all of this kind of thing. And then after 2 weeks, Alessandro says, I'm off to Isola d'Elba for the summer to work, to make some money. So I'm leaving next week. I was like, oh, okay, so who takes over after you? You do. Here are the keys. So I was 18. And he's like, oh, by the way, there's a course of 110 people coming in on Thursday. You'll need to have all the rooms ready. Okay. And it was the best thing ever happened to me, because all of a sudden I was responsible. Yep. And if it didn't happen, it came back to me. And then I was living in this place with all these incredible meditation teachers and all these extraordinary Tibetan lamas who had come out of Tibet in 1959, most of whom aren't alive anymore, but were that generation who had literally walked over the mountains in 1959 and then tried to rebuild their culture in India. It was an incredible time. And the main thing for me that I really took away from it was what in Tibetan Buddhism they call the Bodhisattva Ethic, which is that idea of you live your life as a life of kind of compassionate service to the world, you know. And then when I came across climate change, there was a thing that really struck me that was one of the very famous kind of teachings about this bodhisattva idea. Talks about peacocks who live in a particular grove of trees that drop these poisonous berries, but these particular peacocks are able to eat these berries and transform them into beautiful feathers and plumage, you know, and they use it to say, well, a bodhisattva is able to transform suffering into kind of, you know, enlightenment or whatever. And I feel like, well, we need to do the same thing around the climate emergency. We need to, which is like the poison berries from the tree. If we approach this properly, we can turn this into something that is really a deep, historic, remarkable time of social, cultural transformation.
And you started in Totnes, that what was famous. I remember a documentary a long time ago with local currency and a lot of people doing a lot of projects. And that was in 2005, but lots of years passed. And what were maybe the hopes that were actually met and the one or the difficulties you went through. We can share that because I see myself. I am the founder of a little movement in Morges, in my little town, and it's a bit of a struggle sometimes. Not with the idea. I think the ideas are there, and if you want to catch them, you can. But then the mobilization, like how do you get the people to take out of their time, change a little bit of their life, to give their resources in some ways. This is not, it's more a struggle than I would think. You know, naivety is like, look at what we have. It could be so beautiful if you join. Only you have to join, and the rest will you just appear. And it's not that easy. So I'd like, I'm interested to hear your path, like what you realized, what was a good dream or what turned out to be maybe a nightmare also.
Yeah, so we moved to Totnes in 2005, and I didn't know much about it. I had just been there actually in the last days when I'd been teaching on this course I ran in Ireland. The last big project we did was that we built a theatre with the students in the grounds of the college. We built this theatre inspired by the Globe Theatre in London, using local materials. It was a beautiful, beautiful project. And that college had a theatre course and a permaculture course and a sculpture course. So we wanted to do a project that all the courses could work together on. So the first time I ever went to Totnes was because the church in Totnes is really well known for the gargoyles that it has around the roof. Has this beautiful collection of really old gargoyles. So I came there to take photos of the gargoyles to inspire the sculpture students to make gargoyles for our theatre. And while I was in Totnes, it just has there's a kind of an energy to it, a spirit to it. I thought, yeah, I like this place. Because we were still thinking, well, where are we going to go? We'd lived in Ireland for 10 years. We decided to move back to the UK, but where will we go? So we came there. I didn't have... All I had when we came was this project we'd done in Kinsale. We called the Kinsale Energy Descent Action Plan, which was a project I did with my students to say, okay, it's whatever it was then, 2004. Could we design a 20-year pathway for Kinsale to move away from its dependence on fossil fuels? What would that look like, year by year? Let's tell it as a story. And they did one on food, one on energy, education, tourism, etc., etc. So... And we published this online, and it kind of went crazy. People were like, wow, this is a piece. All the people in the kind of peak oil movements, climate movements at the time were going, this is kind of a thing we've been waiting for. This is really good. So I arrived in Totnes with this thing, thinking there's something in this that's useful, that needs more exploration. And I found some people in Totnes who'd already heard of it and who were kind of excited about it. And we just started I started teaching an evening class. And the people we started showing films about climate change and talking about we needed to do stuff. After about 6 months, people would just stop me in the street and say, okay, we get it. What are we going to do about it? So then we launched it. We did a thing called the official unleashing of Transition Town Totnes. And I love that idea that we should be making history with the things that we do. And then it started with a real kind of momentum. There was food groups forming and an energy group and a housing group. All these different projects started, and we started the Totnes Pound, which was this crazy idea that we could print our own money, which ended up in the press all around the world. It was in the Mexican press and all sorts of, it was extraordinary.
How many people would you say are here involved? Like, because for the one who organized, they're like, okay, but what is the amount of dedicated soul?
So in 2007, 2008, I was doing a PhD that was trying to kind of study what was happening in Totnes. And I did a survey at the time which said that 75% of people had heard of it. 66% of people thought it was a good idea.
Out of how many?
Out of 9,000 people.
Yep.
About 30% had been to something. They'd interacted with it in some way. They'd seen something. And then about 2 to 3% were kind of active in some way, actively involved. But it was, I'd say usually probably the real core of it would have been about 20 people, 25, 30 people. And then there was another 200 or 300 people quite actively involved in the different projects. But then what happened over time was that then some of those projects would start to become a real project. So you'd have a food group. We should do this, we should do that. Would do a big open space on food and invite everyone to think about food, and then that would lead to someone would say, right, we're going to start a farm. Okay, so then those people would take their energy in the direction of starting a farm. Some people would say, we need to create a community energy company. Should we do it? Let's do it. So then they would put all of their energy into creating a community energy company. So the danger that you see in some other transition groups is that after 10 years from this initial really kind of bubbling cauldron of transition energies, is you end up with a few really great new social enterprises, community businesses, which somewhere in their DNA, remember there was this thing called transition 10 years ago. That hasn't happened in Totnes, although there was a couple of years where there was a risk of that. Actually, at its best, sort of around 2013, 2014, there was beautiful work that was going on where all of these projects had started. You know, we had beautiful food projects happening, local economic supporting new businesses. We'd started the brewery that I'm one of the people who run in the town. And actually, we were then doing work that was about trying to tell the story about why all that stuff matters together and what's the economic case for it and what could come out of it if we did more of it. We called it a local economic blueprint, where we were starting to make the economic case for kind of relocalizing. Now there are some projects that have taken a long, long time. So there's one called Transition Homes, which is going to build about 50 energy efficient homes using local materials built as in a kind of a permaculture setting. They're about to start building, but that project's taken about 13 years because these things take a long time. I'm part of a project called Atmos, which is the most ambitious thing. Atmos Totnes. It's the most ambitious project that has come out of this whole process, which is the community becoming the developer on a 3-hectare former industrial site, 62 houses, a hotel, 7,000 square meters of new workspace. And it's a long and complicated story, but we're nearly there, I hope. But a lot of these things take patience and stubbornness and kind of people who realize this is generational work. This isn't something you pick up, do for 2 or 3 years. This is something you do so that then you can hand it on to the next generation. So there are now, I think, from at the beginning. You know, at the beginning, I imagined we were just creating something that hopefully might have an impact on our town. If you'd have told me in 2006 that this was going to spread to 50 countries and thousands of initiatives,
spread to 50 countries?
Yeah, I would have said that'd be ridiculous. Ridiculous. If I'd have thought that there were going to be municipalities in France who were really inspired by transition, that there were going to be that Transition Network was going to be asked to help shape policy in the EU, or that there would be that I would be sitting here in your studio in Switzerland, I'd have thought that was ridiculous. And so that's incredible. Have we transformed Totnes in the way that I would have hoped we would have? I think there are some aspects of it that have been transformative beyond what I would have imagined. Some of the really ambitious projects have been fantastic. But also we're working in a context where in those 16 years since we started transition then, 1/3 of all of the CO2 ever produced by humanity has been produced during those years. The billions and billions and billions of euros have gone into oil and gas, into lobbyists and fake science and political strategies to undermine what we're trying to do. Mm-hmm. I look back now, the Transition Handbook that I wrote in 2008, that book came out, which was the first attempt to sort of say, people say, what are you doing? And I really have no idea. It was the first attempt to set that down. Yeah. That book argued passionately that the degree to which we are dependent on imported fossil fuels and imported food represents a massive vulnerability and a fragility, and that everything we can do to move away from that as quickly as possible builds local resilience, creates more local economic opportunity, and and means we're more likely to be able to survive through the climate crisis. If we had actually, if the leaders around the world at that time had picked that book up and gone, hell yeah, let's do this, we wouldn't have, the EU wouldn't have been sending Vladimir Putin 18 billion euros a month during that time, and how God knows what it sends to other people. Do you know? So actually, we wouldn't be in the situation we are now in terms of climate, in terms of Ukraine, in terms of so many other cost of living crisis happening now. It wouldn't be an issue because we'd have a whole new renewable energy and structure in place. So I look back over those times with a degree of amazement at how an idea from a small little town can spread and inspire people. Or at the places that I go and visit all across Europe. I gave up flying years ago, so I only travel on the train. So I go to visit projects in Europe mainly. What this kind of impulse or this transition invitation, what they've done with it and how proud they are of it and the impact it's had on those communities is always really, really moving. Are we winning? No. But the transition network is as much as anything a network of stories, and those stories, when finally, by which time hopefully it's not too late, we see people in positions of genuine power and influence start to realize that the shift that needs to happen goes way beyond electric cars and e-bikes, and actually means we need to profoundly reimagine the scale in which we do things, then the transition movement has been an extraordinarily important, self-organizing, action learning experiment, which can contribute a huge amount to informing what happens next.
Why do you think it could spread so easily, so naturally, so organically, maybe we can say? Is it the inspiration of, oh, look, it's possible?
I think sometimes there is just an idea. The mental picture I always have of it is sometimes when you go to the beach and there's loads of people surfing and they're all out just at a certain place and they're all waiting for the wave and they're all sitting on their surfboards waiting to catch the right wave.
It can take a long time sometimes.
It can take a long time, but I feel like transition just stood up on its board at the right time, and it as a concept it created a kind of an umbrella that loads of other people who were doing permaculture, urban farming, community energy projects, kind of like good facilitation support work for people doing change making stuff. A whole load of people were like, oh, that's our umbrella. That's our we're part of this. So it gave a name to something that didn't really have a name before. You know, this sort of disparate movement of people who were seeing that the local scale was the scale on which this change needed to really come from. And I think as well that the people who I came together with to think about and design what Transition Network would be as an organization to support this thing that was just growing like mental. And we were like, shit, we would be getting emails from like Iran and Ulaanbaatar and Brazil saying, hey, this transition thing, how do we do it? Can we become a transition town? We're like, oh my God, there's two of us with laptops on our kitchen table. This is crazy. And so we created this organization called Transition Network. Yeah. And the thing that I think we got right was to create a model whereby the values and the principles were really clear. The barriers to getting involved were very low. You felt like you were part of something that celebrated and shared your stories. And the invitation was, take it and run with it and make it your own and be amazing and tell us what you did. And so, you know, when transition started in favelas in Sao Paulo in Brazil, that wasn't because we, you know, like in kind of Coca-Cola head office, put a pin in a map and said, now we take Brazil. You know, it's because people there were excited and inspired and they felt they had that kind of degree of freedom. There's a story I always tell about how in about 2009, I got invited to London by this organization of sort of successful business people who like to give something back to change makers. You know, there's quite a lot of those sort of things. And they said, come and give us a presentation about what you're doing, 15 minutes. And then we'll ask you questions for 15 minutes. And then we'll see if there's ways in which we can support you. You know, maybe some people might want to invest, or some people might say, oh, I'll help with your marketing or whatever. It was that kind of thing. So I went and give my presentation in this, like the 14th floor of some building in London, this long glass metal table. You know. Finished my presentation, long silence. This man says, so what you've done is create a really powerful brand, and then you've given it away for free to people all over the world, and you have no control over them at all. I said, yeah, that's exactly what we've done. He was like, that's completely mad. I was like, well, yeah, in your paradigm, it's mad. Be rich. Exactly. You could be, yeah. So, but it was like in his paradigm, it was insane. Yeah, sure. But actually, that's why it works.
Yeah, it is.
Because there's a lot of trust in there. There's an invitation to be incredible. And then, you know, and then with what we do in Transition Network then is just to be constantly going back to that movement and saying, what are you doing? What are you doing? How's it working? Tell us your stories. And then every book that we've done, the Transition Companion, The Power of Just Doing Stuff, The Essential Guide to Doing Transition, 21 Stories of Transition, all those things that we're putting out as a network to say, this is what transition is, this is how it works, aren't because we're sitting in an ivory tower being kind of intellectual about it. It's because that's what we're hearing, and we're just trying to kind of keep it updated. There was a guy called Luigi Russi, who was a researcher who came to Totnes, spent a whole year. It was the best kind of research, I think. He spent a year kind of embedded there. He went to everything. Every event you'd go to, he was washing up the teacups afterwards and putting out the chairs and stuff. And he said that the thing that is most important about the transition movement isn't the movement part. He said the most important part is the transition moving. The way that this thing, over those 16 years, has changed and adapted and absorbed new influences and responded to challenges and adapted to how it's gone along. And that's the thing I think is most fascinating to me. You know, if you'd have asked me in 2006, at that time, you know, you had something like Occupy, movements like that, which were really influential, but which came and went in about 2 years. You know, absolutely. Things come and they go. They're like a mushroom on an autumn day, you know. Yeah. So, but actually, so there was a lot of intention put into how do we make this thing last? The fact that it's still here after 16 years, I think, is extraordinary.
It is. I think the most impressive part of it. You often use the word community and the sense of community, growing the community itself. Maybe we can try to have a deeper understanding of this notion. What is a community that evolves in the right sense? We kind of intuitively sense what it could be, like feeling confident with your neighbor, having the support when you need it from the people that lives around you. But I have difficulty to put words on this term community. And I think that's a big tool, because I see, as I said earlier, and maybe you can answer on that question, the difficulties of engagement. That's one thing. Even if the people agree, a lot of people are like, "Yeah, you're right," and then, if I'm right, then
what?
Then what?
Yeah.
So these, and also the inclusion part, because I feel that we often are the same kind of people in these movements.
Yeah.
Socially, economically speaking, it's often the same. Even though we try to be inclusive, then we see that it's harder to have a really mix of culture, of differences, I'd say.
I mean, I think community, for me, I know that they serve an important role for some people, but I think, you know, we use this term online community. You know, an online community is a different thing. You know, we saw maybe during the first few weeks of COVID, maybe we saw that was what community was the people who came around to check you needed things, the people who who you knew that if you got sick might take your dog for a walk, the people who
bring you food.
bring you food. You know, that's when you start to see it, I think. You know, the reason we like to work on that kind of scale is because it's a place that's easier to move. You can get things moving faster, I think, at that scale than if you're trying to shift national policy, for example. And I see again and again and again that, you know, 5 or 10 people working together can do incredible things. And I think over the years, I've come to think about it as being like if you want to establish a new coral reef, you don't start a coral breeding program and breed loads of coral. You put something into the sea. Normally they just chuck loads of old cars into the same place and make a kind of a structure of old cars in the sea that then the coral will form around. So I'm always thinking about, okay, what do we need to put in place that community can then form on? So, for example, I mentioned the brewery that I run in Totnes. You know, one of the things about that was we have a tap room, a bar, very, very popular in a kind of community setting, and it's really designed to be that kind of coral reef. You know, so many people come and we host events, and this happens there and that happens there. That couldn't happen if that space wasn't there. I think, you know, the question about how do we include people, you know, is the question I get asked most by transition groups, because it's really tough, and I'm not saying it's easy. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I agree. We ask that because we see that's where we kind of fail.
Not
in like fail. Yeah, it's a bit much to say fail, but
it's a struggle.
Yeah, and we have like a wish to be inclusive, but we see it's not happening.
Yeah, really. I mean, again, so that's why I think, like, going back to that coral reef metaphor, it's like how can we design the projects that will be the coral reef that the people we want to get involved will feel attracted to, and designing it in such a way means, I think, I did a beautiful course a couple of years ago called The Art of Invitation, which was all about getting the invitation right really matters. So we might design a poster, right? We're going to host an event to talk about climate change. We'd like you to come. So we design it in the fonts that we're familiar with. We use images that we're familiar with. We use a venue that we're familiar with. We maybe don't think, okay, there are some people, the people we're trying to reach, that font for them might have particular kind of associations. They're never going to go to a talk in that place. They're never going to go to a talk in a church because they're Muslim, or they're never going to go to a talk in a pub or in a bar because they're Muslim, so they can't go to a bar. So that kind of mindfulness about the invitation needs to run through the venue that we choose, how we present it. Are we presenting it and hosting it in such a way that people who are very introverted feel included, that people who can't hear very well are included, that people who feel really anxious because they've been inside for 2 years with COVID can feel welcomed and invited too. And that's a whole, you know, she on that The Art of Invitation course, she says when you design a big event, if you want it to be really successful, 40% of the time and the resource needs to go into the invitation, 20% into the actual event, and then 40% afterwards into digesting what happened at that event and then sharing that with everybody who was there. So it could be that the best thing to do isn't to do a talk about climate change. Maybe the best thing is to organize a street party or some kind of a musical event or something. One of the first things that Transition Town Tooting did that was great was that they did what they called an earth walk, where they went around to visit all the places of worship in their neighborhood, the mosques, the Hindu temples, the synagogue, the churches, and they asked the minister or the rabbi, whatever from each tradition, to talk about how in that faith they talk about care of the planet and care of the earth. And the connections that they built by doing that, because no one ever goes to the mosque and says, hi, tell us about this. You know, so they started to build those relationships, and they recently produced this amazing kind of relationships map of what they've done over the last 12, 13 years in Tooting. And then what projects that led to. The fact they did that with the mosque meant they get to meet the imam who introduced them to these people. And that then led to that project where they went and created that garden on that street, which otherwise wouldn't have happened. So so how we invite people to be part of things is really important. And the other thing I would say to that is that I think it's one of the great kind of leaps forward in the middle of transition, I think, was what we call Reconomy. The Reconomy project was this observation that if we don't get to a stage where transition is creating a lot of jobs for people, then transition is going to end up as an exclusively middle-class white movement that doesn't really have very much impact. Mm-hmm. Because if we imagine we're going to change the world, change our neighborhoods to the extent that the climate change demands that we do, with a few volunteers who meet on a Wednesday evening once a month, it's not going to happen. So we have to be, if you look at the cooperative movement in the mid-1800s in the UK, that started as an idea like transition. Within about 20 years, they were one of the biggest employees in that region of the UK. If we approach transition with a kind of entrepreneurial kind of mindset, and we're looking at what needs to happen, and we're thinking at every project, how can we create work for people here? How can we create jobs? It should be here in this neighborhood in 10, 15 years' time, the biggest just source of new work is coming through transition. There's so much we have to do. Renewable energy installations on all the buildings, insulating all the homes, taking up the concrete, the tarmac, so they're more porous, and planting trees so people don't die in the heat as the summers get hotter, creating food gardens, what I call it the great reskilling. You know, we need to be learning these skills on such a scale. Mm-hmm. So we have to bring that in, because I remember a few years ago I met did a talk with this incredible woman from Richmond, California, called Doria Robinson, one of my great sheroes. And she said, I talked about this and how transition was moving in this direction. She said, it's so good to hear you say that, because if this is a revolution that depends on volunteers, I can't be part of it. And no one in my neighborhood can be part of it. People work 6 days a week just to keep a roof over their head. And you expect them to come and volunteer for hours on some project? You forget it. So we have to be moving in that direction and transforming the economies of the places where we live.
Mm-hmm. I agree really, and thank you for sharing that. Sometimes I'm like, we'll talk about that, and I'm like, yes, but kind of a feeling that's circular. You were talking about that yesterday in your talk. Yes, and I feel these when you have a brewery, for instance, then you sell beer. There's a product, but I would say 90% of what I do is volunteering on volunteer basis.
Yeah.
And I'm like, but what product am I selling? It's hard to say, well, I'm trying to put the people together to do a citizen assembly in my town. I try to create the environment and the governance in small group of work that cleans the river, or that. And I'm like, who is going to give money for that? I have a part of a blank where I'm like, how else than volunteer? Who? Yeah, you know what I mean? It's like,
so a citizens' assembly, for example. So if a citizens' assembly is going to really have the impact that it needs to have, then it needs to be done with the local authority.
Yeah, that's what I did. Yeah.
So the local authority need to agree that they will implement and respect the outcomes of a citizens' assembly. It was why the one in France was so disappointing, because Macron at the beginning said, I will do that, and then when he got them, he was like, okay, I think we'll drop most of these. So it has to have that degree of commitment. And I've been part of a few citizens' assemblies run by local authorities. I've gone along and presented at them, 3 or 4 in the UK now. Too. And I would argue that actually the municipality should be funding that appropriately, and they should be working with community groups like yourself to help facilitate that, and they should be realizing they need to pay for that. They shouldn't be expecting all of the input from the community to come on a voluntary basis. If it's a process, they give the respect and the credibility that it deserves, then that should be something where, in effect, the local transition group is acting as a consultant to that process, and paid accordingly. You know, I mentioned the brewery that I run. Yeah, it's true that we're selling something, but that was a conscious choice. You know, we could have said, and there were people at the beginning of creating it who were like, yeah, we should run it like a kind of community volunteer thing, and we should just come together and brew beer and give it away. Actually, there's now 12 people in the town who can pay their mortgage because of that project.
Yeah.
You know, so it's a kind of it's a way of when I spend time around entrepreneurs, it just blows my mind, because the way, I mean, obviously there are some horrific, ghastly entrepreneurs, and I'm not talking like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, but people who are able to look at a project and say, okay, well, the municipality should contribute to this bit. We can crowdfund for this bit. We can have the money here, move it over here, and we pay these people with that, and then that will, it's a different way of looking, which most people who come, myself included, who come from a background of activism, we just don't have, and actually often have a built-in resistance to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's the point. Like, sometimes I have resistance because I'm like, but then if we do that, we're reproducing, the world we are pretending to transition from.
No, I don't know. I don't agree, because I always remember a moment for me when I was a kind of how old was I? 21, bit of an anarchist, kind of permaculturist, and I went along to this course on eco-village design, how to build an eco-village. This guy called Max Lindiger from Australia, brilliant permaculturist, eco-village designer. And I asked him a question, stupid question looking back. I said something like, how do we design non-profit eco-villages so they don't make any money? He was like, well, if you don't make any money, then you lose money. I had never actually thought of that before. That's actually really quite interesting. No one's talking about becoming a millionaire, but if you don't at least make more money than you lose, then you're going to be just like, and where's that? Yeah. Where does that come from? So it's the things that, the way that I think the thinking needs to shift is that everywhere where we see, and I'm not sure what the Swiss equivalent is, but a company like Sodexo in France, who manage like the big food contracts for hospitals, universities. In the UK, it's Serco and Sodexo, who charge a lot of money to provide hotel catering or catering for different things, or provide laundry services on a really big scale. Everywhere where there is a Sodexo contract is a potential cooperative, is a potential new enterprise owned and run by the community. In Cleveland, in Ohio, in the hospital, they started something called the Evergreen Co-Ops, really poor neighborhoods, predominantly people of color, and they started a co-op to do the laundry, a co-op to do the energy, a co-op to produce the food. They now grow a lot of the food in Cleveland in greenhouses they built. They generate the energy from installing loads and loads of solar throughout Cleveland. Mm-hmm. It's a fantastic project. They're generating money. They're running it as a profitable business, but they're running it with a completely different moral value set underpinning the whole thing. That I've not yet met a transition millionaire, and I probably doubt I ever will, because people don't go into it for that. But actually, there's no reason why, if we're going to be designing a new economy that's making jobs for people, it should be profitable. We should be able to find ways to do that. But then the point is that the money stays locally. The Atmos project, which I mentioned before, which I'm part of in Totnes, the vision of that excites me so much is it's 3 hectares, as I said, 62 homes, 7,000 square meters of workspace, a hotel, music venue. The conventional model would be you borrow the money over 10 years, you extract as much profit as possible, you design it to meet the needs of the developer, not of the people, and you design in such a way that you maximize the profit out of every single bit. After 10 years, you've made your money and you're out, and you've paid back all the bank loans and you've made millions of pounds. Our model is you borrow the money over 30 years, 35 years, which means that you don't need the profit margin. You're building, it's financed in a different way. And it means that you design something based on the needs of the community, which is what we've done. And then once it's paid off the money that it's borrowed, then every year it's generating £2-3 million, which stays in the community, which the community then decides what to do with. Imagine if 40 years ago in this town here, you'd had three of the big housing developments built at the time were built using that model. How different would our sense as a community be of how we can address climate change, how we found a way through COVID, if we had put all of that, if that had happened then?
And maybe we'll have the money to actually found the project I was referencing earlier.
Exactly. It would be so we need it's that kind of bigger scale, kind of ambitious thinking that I think we need to get better at.
Yeah, and that start with something you're familiar and advocate. That's the imagination. And sometimes when I come to your workshop and stuff, I'm like, yeah, I know it, but like, I like the image you give. Like, it's like a muscle. We're not training, and we need to train this muscle. And sometimes I feel like I have these patterns of way of thinking and way of seeing things. And then I'm trying, but I'm not open enough to imagine really what could be, and only to listen to you and experience help a little bit with that. And I noticed yesterday. So for the people who are listening to us now, can you, because I've heard you and I think we can, I agree with that, but I think it's important to come back why imagination is that important and what role it can play in the future of transition.
Yeah. Well, I think the imagination, so I started to get interested in it as a topic to explore more, because I kept reading people who write about climate change like Naomi Klein and Bill McKibben, who I really respect. Yeah. And this sentence kept coming up in their writings where they would say, climate change is a failure of the imagination. And I would be left thinking, what do you mean? That's really interesting. What does that mean? By which time they were off talking about something else. I was still there going, what do you mean by that? That was really interesting. So I started doing some looking around and trying to find, well, could that be the case? Could it be that we're living in a time of a failure of the imagination? And I found some really interesting research that suggested that from about until the mid-1990s, IQ and imagination had been rising together. And then around the mid-90s, they separated, and IQ kept rising, and imagination started to decline, and it's been declining ever since. So when that research was published, it made the front page of Newsweek magazine. It was a massive story. People were saying, oh, what does this mean for economic growth? What does this mean for Hollywood? What does this mean for, I don't know, Oreo biscuits? Nobody ever said, what does this mean for the climate emergency? What does this mean for social justice movements?
For happiness.
Because you can't build something if you can't imagine it first. So if we're coming into a time when the climate scientists are demanding, are actually screaming at us now, climate scientists are supergluing themselves to the front doors of banks, sticking their published papers onto the fronts of the banks, are saying we have to fundamentally reimagine everything in this tiny period of time. And if our imaginations aren't up to the job, then we're really, really in trouble. So the work that I'm doing is, my favorite definition of imagination by a guy called John Dewey, who was an American educationalist. He said it's the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise, which I think is just beautiful. That capacity to see beyond what's in front of us to what actually could be. It's why the book is called From What Is to What If. How do we move from one thing to another? So the work that I do with people is around, you talked about it as a muscle. It's like, how do we exercise that? Because I spoke to a researcher who has been doing work over the last 30 years, kind of evaluating the imagination of children from about 3 to 5. She says, I've seen no decline over those 30 years. It's kind of held pretty strong over that time. But something happens when they reach the age of 5 or 6, and their imaginations just start to kind of desiccate, and which is school. And we have designed this education system, which is, I think, profoundly damaging to the human imagination.
There's this talk, very famous TED talk, Sir Ken Robinson, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
I think the most viewed one.
Yeah, which
he explained that failure of the school system to actually make the imagination flourish. Instead, it just plummet.
It's incredible. And if people haven't watched that TED Talk, I really recommend it. And
it's very funny.
It's very funny. He's one of the, either he has a really amazing script writer,
yeah,
or he's just extraordinarily funny.
He's done 3 then since, but I think he passed away.
He did. And actually it was I wanted to interview him when I was writing the book SC, or From What Is to What If, and it was just when he was ill. But he wrote I sent him a copy of it, and he wrote an endorsement. So it was a real honor to have got an endorsement from him for the book. So it's. I feel like at the very time in our history when we have to reimagine everything, our imaginations are facing this kind of perfect storm. There was a guy in America called Henry Giroux, who's a political sort of academic guy, who talked about the Trump disimagination machine. And this idea of a disimagination machine, I think there are so many things that are working together to undermine our collective imagination. So we spend less and less time in nature, which is really good for our imagination. We don't play. Our kids grow up today, they don't play in that kind of, so much in that free, unstructured, let's pretend kind of a way. They tend to just be sort of taxied from one thing to another, to another, to another, and then stuck in front of a screen. And they don't have that kind of free play. I think, the rise of testing in schools and the anxiety and the stress that creates for young people. We know that the part of our brain where the imagination fires from really, really struggles when it's stressed or in trauma or anxiety. And we have an economy which has created this sort of precariat, what people call the precariat, this sort of people who are really, really vulnerable. Something like 40% of people in the UK now have savings of less than £500 at any one time. And it creates a level of stress and anxiety that's really damaging. Cortisol is lethal to the imagination. Also, I think when you live in a world where you know that the diversity of the natural world around you is decreasing, is also really harmful to the imagination. There was a microbiologist called René Debow who said, if we lived on the moon, our imagination would be as barren as the moon. During my lifetime, we've lost 70% of the creatures we share this planet with. And I think that kind of what somebody calls the great thinning is also really damaging to our imagination. So there's many, many things I think that are really harmful. And what I tried to do with the book was to sort of take something that was just out of our eye line, just sort of over here somewhere that we weren't looking at, and our imaginations just slowly desiccating and withering, and to put it back right in the middle of the table and say, this really matters. This is really important. Yeah. And that's what I try and do with the workshops and the talks.
Yeah, we're not used to that. And you have been doing that for like 2 years now or something?
Yeah, something like that,
more.
Yeah, 2 or 3.
What have you witnessed or see when you propose this? You need to be building a secure place because, imagination can be silly or perceived as ridiculous and stuff, and you do that well, I think. What have come out of these idea that you have to build that up?
I think often when you do that process with people, it's really moving. A lot of the time I see people kind of reconnecting with a part of them that they had cut themselves off from because it was silly, and you're an adult now and you don't do that and you don't play. And so it's why in the workshop yesterday,
Potato creature.
Yeah, exactly. We always start with this exercise called potato creatures, where you put people into groups of 5 or 6. You give them a handful of potatoes and some cocktail sticks, and say, "I want you back here in 20 minutes with a creature that you've invented. You can go outside and add anything to it that you want, and I want to know its name and what it eats and what its mating call is. Go." And I've done it in so many places. Yeah. And this is lovely because you just hear people giggling. They go off in groups and they're like, they're going to giggle for about 20 minutes in a way that maybe they haven't done for years. And we're so conditioned by school that actually here's a problem and there's one solution to it. And we're terrified we're going to get the wrong solution to it. The beauty of that exercise is you cannot make anything out of potatoes and cocktail sticks that isn't ridiculous. If you're an engineer and you're like, I'm going to make a beautiful exact replica of you can't do it with potato, particularly in 20 minutes. You can't. So everybody, it frees people up to be able to be silly and to celebrate the fact this thing is just whatever we do, this is going to look ridiculous. Yeah. So let's just make it look ridiculous. And it's a really nice way to start to get people into a different mindset. You know, I've done workshops. Sometimes I go and do a kind of a 2-day retreat, imagination retreat with people in a company or something. And the whole idea with the first day we just play and we do silly things and we go outside and we do stuff in a way and for a lot of them it's really moving and really emotional, partly because they realize how distant they've become from it, partly because it makes them think about how they're raising their own children and their own children's experience. But what I see, I guess, through doing those workshops and what I hear is that it opens up. You know, it's what I was saying yesterday. You know, I think one of the things the imagination needs most is space. You know, everybody listening to this will know the time when you're at your most imaginative is when you have space, not when you're stressed and anxious and with deadlines. Albert Einstein always said he got his best ideas riding his bike in the forest. That kind of space is so rare and so precious. And if we expect our organizations, our communities, our campaigns, our activism to shift to be more imaginative, we have to intentionally make space. And so you have to really fight for that space sometimes. And you're really, there are people in the organization always who'll say, oh, we don't have time for that. Oh, we've got this to do. We've got that to do. It's like, no, this is the most important thing. This is the most important thing you can be doing right now, is to make this space. If you work in the Department of Transport, for example, and you don't make space, or you work for the municipality in Geneva and you don't intentionally make space to explore how could we make this a car-free city, it's never going to happen, because otherwise we're just too busy. So making space and fighting for that space, holding that space and facilitating that space, which is a whole other sort of skill set that we need to massively multiply in our population. Gil Scott-Heron always said, the revolution will not be televised. I always tell people now the revolution will be well facilitated, and we have to have an army of people with facilitation skills, because that's the main thing.
Isn't it also a way to shift the focus on the present moment? That could be also a Buddhistic approach. Let's say we're so focused on the result that we don't give value to the time, the quality of time, the quality of anything that we're doing together in that way. You also can find the motivation, because you're like, well, if we don't reach the goal, at least we laughed. And this already is a goal, a part of the goal.
Yeah, there was, so going back to when we were talking about the early days of transition in Totnes, so it was myself and a guy called Naresh Jangrande who started calling it transition and started this process and so on and so on. And after a couple of months, there were two women who came to see us, Sophie Banks and Hilary Prentice, and they came to us and said, if this process is going to work, it needs to recognize and support the inner dimension of this work, because this is not just a process which is about solar panels and electric cars. This is going to be a long process. It's going to be a process that is going to encounter moments of despair and grief and times when it feels completely impossible, and there will be moments when people won't agree with each other. There will be moments of conflict. And so how this happens matters as much, if not more, than what it is. And that led to what we call inner transition. It started, the Totnes group had a group called the Heart and Soul Group, whose role was to kind of provide that, support that kind of inner dimension of this process. And the work they did, the work they still do is extraordinary. There's going to be a book, I think, in about 6 months coming out. The first book about inner transition, the guy called Vincent Watelet in Belgium is co-writing a book on inner transition, which is going to be really, really good. Because we need to have those tools to run good meetings that people want to be part of, people feel exhilarated by. We need to not be replicating in the culture of our groups the paradigms that we're trying to get rid of. I speak to people who work in some large green NGOs. It sounds horrific. It's like this very similar work culture that you might find in Amazon or something sometimes. So we need to be modeling. So in Transition Network, we use holacracy. We're a flat structure. It's a whole different culture for how you run an organization, how you run meetings. It's incredible. So designing that in and being conscious of that has been fundamental to the transition movement ever since Hilary and Sophie knocked on my door, and I'm eternally grateful that they did. Because as we were talking before about the amazing, the transition movement is still here after 16 years. One of the reasons for that is because they came along and said that. You know, the durability of transition, I think, is because of a lot of those aspects to it, and the attention paid to making sure that all the voices are included, and that's one of the things I think is most extraordinary about it.
Yeah, well put. And yesterday, you didn't really talk about that, but at the Flower of Imagination, which space, place, pacts, and practice.
Oh, the sundial, the Imagination Sundial, yeah.
Okay, sundial. Can you elaborate on that? I was very interested, but you said that you were not going to spend, because there were a lot of people who went to your previous talk.
Yeah, it was a bit deceptive that, because so during the talk the night before, because I was
not there.
Okay, so I knew there were going to be about 100 people at the workshop the next day, and the talk the day before was sold out. It was about 500 something people.
Mad.
So we asked them, how many people here are going to be coming to the workshop tomorrow because it's useful for Rob to know? About 30 people put their hands up. Okay, 30 people out of 100. So the majority of people there won't have heard it before. I'll repeat a lot of that stuff. Then on the morning of the workshop, how many people were in the thing last night? About 80 people put their hands up.
I saw you.
Where were you all?
What? That was not planned.
Were you asleep at the back or something? I don't know what was going on. But yeah, the Imagination Sundial came about because when I wrote From What Is to What If, there was a young guy who was renting a room in my house at that time, also called Rob Shorter, who was doing a master's at Schumacher College, which is very close to where I live, and we often rent rooms to people who are studying at Schumacher College. And he had come on a workshop I did at Schumacher College about where I was at that stage in terms of the research I was doing for the book. So he said, I'd like to do my dissertation for this course based on what you've got in the book, and I want to do it about the economics of imagination. Okay, good. So then we had lots of conversations that were kind of the research, part of the research for the dissertation that he did. And then he said, I've got this idea, it looks like sometimes you need fresh eyes on what you're doing, right? So he said, it looks to me like there are 4 kind of key things here. And then together we started playing around with it, and that goes under that, and that goes under that. And then he turned this sort of sketch that we'd done on the back of an envelope into this beautiful, kind of colourful visual that we call the Imagination Sundial. The idea is basically, if we recognise that we are in a time of imaginative poverty and imaginative kind of desiccation at the worst possible time for that to be the case, and we recognise that we need to rebuild. We need to recognize the right to live an imaginative life as a universal right, and we need to build what I call an imagination infrastructure in society to support a kind of a flourishing of the imagination again. Then what would we do? And so in the Sundial, we break it down into 4 pieces. So space, which we've just talked about. The imagination needs space, and we have to intentionally create that space. We need place, and by place I mean places that you go to where afterwards when you come home you see the possibilities of your home place through new eyes. I'm sure everybody listening to this, watching this will have places they've been to, might be an amazing permaculture project, or a particular city that had loads of renewable energy, or going to Rotterdam. And if you're a cyclist, Rotterdam is like, oh my God, why isn't everywhere like this? So those places you go to afterwards, you're like, why isn't everywhere like this? You know, those places are so precious, and they can be a whole town like we've been trying to do with Totnes or Ungersheim in Alsace, which is a beautiful example. Or they can just be a street or a project or a school with a vegetable garden, or all of those things where you can go and kind of touch and feel and taste and interact with what that future could be like, are really precious. And also this idea that I call pop-up tomorrows. You know, how in a space do you give it a little makeover that helps people to imagine what 2030 could be like? Third one is practices, so things we do together that expand our imagination, which is sort of things that I collect and then share on the course, different things that I've seen that are useful, and we do some of them together to give the imagination a bit of a workout. And one of the most important of those practices is the ability to ask really good what-if questions. And then the fourth one is pacts, which is an odd word to be including in this thing about imagination. But that links to the story of the Civic Imagination Office in Bologna in Italy, where in 2012 the municipality noticed a real decline of people being involved in local politics, voting, local democracy. So they created what they called the Civic Imagination Office, which I just love it as a name. It's so beautiful. Every city, every town should have a Civic Imagination Office. And in the Civic Imagination Office, they run big visualizing, future dreaming activities. But the brilliant bit is that when people come up with an idea, they sit with them and say, okay, let's make that happen. We'll offer this and this, you offer that. Good, let's make a pact. So that idea that for so many people, their imagination is never invited. You might get invited to a consultation where they've already decided really what they want to do, and it's just a pretty box-ticking exercise. So your imagination is invited, but not really, and then ignored anyway. And then you feel like, well, what's the point? What we need to create is a culture where we invite people to be imaginative. We then take some of those ideas, make them a reality, ideally working with them, and then say, okay, we did that. Now what can we do? And then you start to create this kind of a trickle up of imagination through a culture, which is so important. If people want to find out more about the Transition Sundial, if they look on my website, robhopkins.net, and put Sundial into the search, you can download the graphic, and there's also a whole document there that goes through different examples and different stories of each one.
The lesson I learned is when you do the exercise of yes, but, like first someone propose something, and we can try actually, that would be funny. And then you ask to be negative. So we kind of know what's going to happen when you're negative. So you shut off the idea, and after a few attempts, you stop being creative because you're then in a position that's quite obvious.
Yeah.
What I learned though in this exercise is that when you're neutral, it does exactly the same.
Exactly the same.
And it's not really violent or anything. There's no bad intent, but just say, yeah. Then you're like, well, if this person is not going to take what I'm saying, then I'm not going to continue either. So a neutral position is actually a killer.
It's a killer because it's kind of pretending that it's listening, but it's really not. Yeah. So that's just to explain to everybody. It's an exercise that I learned from studying improv theatre, and so you do it in 3 rounds. Where the scenario is you're planning a picnic. So, you know, and you take it in turns to make a suggestion. And in the first round, the role of the other person is to just be really negative about it. So, you know, you might say, oh, I'm going to make some sandwiches to bring on the picnic. Oh, I've had your sandwiches before, they were shit. All right. Okay. You know, and then the second round, they accept your idea, but just with no enthusiasm at all, you know, shrug of the shoulders. If you want to bring sandwich, I mean, like, you know, knock yourself out. Business. You know, it's your business. Like, you know, I'm gluten intolerant, and but if you want to bring sandwiches, you know. And then in the third one, you accept the other person's idea and you build off it. You know, I'll bring sandwiches. Oh God, I love sandwiches. I'll tell you what, I'll bring some relish to go in. So, oh yeah, I love that relish that you make, and maybe actually we could, and then we could, and then we could, and then you build and you build and you build this kind of story that only this kind of ridiculous scenario people end up where they've
let's do it. Let's do it. What if 1,000 people is listening to this podcast at the end?
Yeah, and if every one of those people went and told 30 of their friends about it, and it grew and it grew like that.
Yeah, and after they make research, some of them in their town or neighborhood, and they find that there's two person trying for 2 years already something, but never could because they don't have enough people. So they want to meet.
And what if listening to that podcast, what if Switzerland's richest man was tuning into your podcast? And at that moment, there was an idea that just completely inspired him. And he was like, oh, I need to move my resources into enabling this whole future to flourish.
Yeah, and then we could, then with this money, hire so many people, and then the municipality would be reassured and they would be on board, and then they would allow people to participate, non-elected people, but citizen-led, motivated people to take part of the decision, and then they would actually organize agora every week in the main street of the town.
Yes, and it could become the story everybody knows about this town. There could be insect hotels on the wall of every house here. It could become the most biodiverse town in Switzerland just within the next 10 years.
That would be wonderful.
Anyway, and so on, and so on, and so
on. Yeah, I can see that your muscle is more flexed than mine. And it's still a bit of a struggle, but that's beautiful. And what it does, the smile is keep rising through the ears. Exactly. And that's what actually is fun. But we tend to protect ourselves. I think the cultural response of yes, but it's not like because I want to take you down, but it's because what if it doesn't work? Then we're going to be disappointed because
I mean there are times when yes, but is appropriate.
I was saying that yesterday. Sometimes it may be appropriate, but I could not really say when.
It's like if the Prime Minister says we're going to expand oil and gas production, then we need a very big yes, but. Well, actually, we need a no, absolutely not.
Not that one.
Not that one. But I think it is the thing that I love with. There's another exercise I do when I do a talk and I have a room full of people. Is I say, right, get into pairs. I always get people into pairs with someone they didn't know before, because I say, even if this talk is terrible, you'll at least know somebody you didn't know before you came. And in a time where there's an epidemic of loneliness, that's really important. So I show them an object, anything. Often it's my shoe. I take my shoe off. I say, right, with your partner, you've got 2 minutes to think of as many alternative uses for my shoe as possible. There are no right answers to this question. This isn't school. Just allow your imaginations just to run. What else could you do with my shoe? Go. And then for 2 minutes, you look around them. I love it. You look around them. Their eyes are really bright. They're really engaged. They're kind of leaning towards each other. They're laughing.
Yeah.
And I say to people at the end, if we're going to do everything that we need to do in the next 10 years, it needs to feel like that. It's not going to work if our imagination is it's going to feel like a long walk home in the rain on a damp November Thursday. Just talking about extinction and collapse. And it's like, it needs to feel like this. Why couldn't it feel like this? Of course it could feel like this.
Yeah. I do the same exercise as an icebreaker, though it's not that deep, with a clipper. And I say, okay, what can you do with a clipper? And then everyone gives how many they can. And then I put it all together and we see that all together we have imagination. If we lack imagination alone, that's possible. We need to flex it. But when you tap into people's group, then it's there. And we could see that yesterday. The what if they were like I don't know, maybe like 2, 3, 100, like what if? Yeah. So as soon as people take the time in a safe environment, the ideas are here. I mean, examples are here.
Absolutely. And you know, I always wonder how many, because we don't create the space for that kind of process of generating and sharing and celebrating the what if questions that come through the process, then you know, how many of the great ideas that could be transformative to this time just don't happen because those processes aren't in place, or because we reach for our phone instead, because there's these highly addictive things we carry around in our pockets. We reach for those instead rather than sitting and looking out the window and daydreaming. You know, we need more daydreaming in our lives. We have to. It's why I think, you know, a universal basic income or a variation on that.
We voted in Switzerland in 2016 to get
So where is it?
I was campaigning for years to collect, you know, the signature. If you get 100,000 signatures, you can then have a project, and then the entire population has to vote on it.
Okay.
And the result was 27% of yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it was too advanced for the Swiss people. But put any question in the Swiss people, they will be very of a thing.
Exactly. So, or like a 4-day working week. I think all of those things are really important imagination strategies, because
then you have time, space for imagination.
Exactly.
Yeah, you need to degrowth also of the idea that you need to break every aspect of your life, like. Slow, take time, take it slow. That's how I started. But I think that's also kind of a privileged, because I was educated enough, having a family that could provide some time so I can travel for a while before I start working after my studies and stuff. And I had this chance to actually live with a rhythm that was then where it was possible to have this space and start thinking about what are we doing with the world, and so on and so on. So it's to put it in place in the world we live in, with the expectation of everything. It seems to be a struggle to find that spaces, and that's the last topic I want to discuss with you today. Is there's also, because we are talking about the people who built kind of the new world, if it's a bit arrogant to say that, but try to transition and propose other ideas, other view of the world, vision. But you also have, and I'm also part of this, the fighting aspects of like Extinction Rebellion, of the transition, who is like trying to block or to... What are we trying to do? Yeah, to make these destructive institution stop.
Yeah. Not a big ask, is it really? Please stop being a psychopath. No.
There was this documentary, The Corporation, Canadian documentary. I think that this one had a huge effect on me.
Yeah.
Where they make the case of a corporation has the right to be a psychopath in this behavior, and they prove it point to point.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. But what do you think about these? Do you see as an opposition? No, I'm sure not. But I think it's two kind of way of transitioning we need to have. And your thought on that?
Yeah, I think Extinction Rebellion are incredible, and my wife's very, very involved with Extinction Rebellion. She's been arrested about 7 times. She's really brave and extraordinary people, like so many of those people. And very, very committed. And there's also Just Stop Oil now.
In Switzerland we have Switzerland Renovate, but Renovate probably is everywhere. Basically they're going to...
like Insulate Britain, who sit in the roads.
Yeah, in highway, actually.
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
Because I sit on bridges, but like normal road, and I was in the court on Monday.
Oh, were you? Yeah. Oh, well done. Thank you.
No problem. But I feel like sometimes it's depressing, because you're trying, all the way, but you don't see, and it's frustrating. And we talked already about eco-anxiety, but I'm more like eco-angry.
Yeah, good.
What do you think?
Yeah, eco furious. I don't know.
Yeah,
if you
eco-furious.
can swear on this program, but it's fucking furious. Yeah, and actually, you know, I always say I feel like we need a really big, bold, beautiful no and a big, bold, beautiful yes. We need those things working alongside each other.
Yeah,
and actually, a lot of people who are involved in XR are also involved in transition and vice versa, because it's the same work. It's just a different outlet, a different manifestation for the same care and concern and love, really, for the world and for for communities and our family and for the non-human world. You know, it's all a different expression of that. And yeah, I think Extinction Rebellion are extraordinary, and you know, because we have to shut the oil and gas industry down within the next 5 or 6 years. There is no choice, and the oil and gas industry knew about climate change in the 1970s because they were the ones doing the research, and they decided sometime in the mid-70s, actually, we're going to just deny and sow doubt and fund junk science, and fund by politicians, by the media.
Same shit with the tobacco industry at the
same as the tobacco industry,
with the advertisement industry.
Exactly, and you know, I think, you know, when I come into contact with conspiracy theorist people who've constructed some extraordinary web of nonsense that connects this to this to this to this, I'm like, how do you really need any more terrifying conspiracy theory than the oil and gas industry? Like, which is totally evidenced that in the 70s they knew this was happening. They decided to just junk science their way through it, to lie, to put billions and billions and billions of dollars into toxifying our politics, our media, everything, and who are still planning to extract oil and gas for the next 20, 30, 40 years, just putting greenwash onto what they're doing. Well, we're, you know, 5% of our investments into renewables. Sorry. You need to go. You need to disappear. You need to be shut down. You need to be nationalized and shut down. And so our politicians won't do that because they're basically in the UK. They are the same people.
Yeah.
So
revolving door.
Revolving door. So it absolutely has to be people putting their bodies on the line and people disrupting things, because that's what makes change happen.
So it's a good sharing with your wife. She's going to jail.
She's not going
doing
to
the
jail
jailing,
yet.
and you're doing the safe advocating. And what about your kids? How? Because I think this part of education and the next generation, we always say, well, the next generation will be the one who has to deal with the shit we won't have brought solutions.
I mean, I think my kids are kind of... they've grown up around this stuff all the time. So they've grown up in a house that grows quite a lot of the food that it makes, is always trying to save energy, where we're insulating. They've grown up in a house with solar panels and full of bicycles. And our intention as parents was always just to make that stuff completely normal. So as a family, we never flew for holidays. We would always go quite near or go on the train or something like that. And so that's really who they are. So 2 of them now are vegan. 2 of them, they're kind of little bits of meat. You know, but they're very conscious of these things and want to really design that into who they are and to how they work. One of them is a carpenter, is really committed to sort of building beautiful things with wood. One's a barber. You know, one of them studying fashion photography, but is really struggling actually with the fact that if you're a fashion photographer, it means that they're like, okay, we need you in Singapore for a shoot on Tuesday and in New York on Thursday, and then back here in London for a thing by Sunday. And they just fly. And he's like, okay, I want to do this work, but I need to reinvent this profession because I'm not going to be doing that level of flying. That's not going to happen. So yeah, I think they've all kind of absorbed and, you know, questioned some of it, as in entirely rightly, and found their own version of it. Yeah, but I think the thing that's really important is that they grew up with the belief that all of that stuff is just normal. Yeah.
Normally this podcast is always kind of bleak, because also the guests they give like a bad, and then we're all depressed. Yeah, we're all depressed. We're like, oh,
misery
fuck,
hour.
we're screwed. And so maybe I'll finish on a better note today.
Okay.
What are the source of your motivation and the hopes you have for today and tomorrow?
So the sources of my hopes are the fact that I get to go and visit so many places where people are doing this work already. So I get to see so many kind of inspiring things on the ground. And I'm always looking for stories of change and stories where good things are happening. A lot of the inspiration for the work that I do actually comes from black women activist writers in the US. I think a lot of the best work being done around imagination is coming from there at the moment. People like Adrienne Marie Brown, Walida Imarisha, Mariam Kaba, people who are exploring that kind of intersectionality around imagination and where it overlaps with gender and race and politics. The prison abolition movement, the borders abolition movement, I think are just extraordinary. So, those communities who have experienced far more oppression, brutality, marginalization than I've ever experienced in my life, and the way that they're centering imagination in what they do, disabled communities, LGBT communities, queer communities, and writers who are exploring that space through imagination, that's where a lot of my inspiration comes from, and music, and art, and stuff, and trees.
That was for the source of motivation, and now the hopes.
Well, I guess the way I would just answer that question is that Peter Kalmus, who's an amazing climate scientist in America, who recently superglued himself to the front of Chase Bank in Manhattan, and who's an incredible activist. He says, what gives me hope is that we've barely tried yet. We've barely tried yet. So don't give up hope yet, because we've not tried any of this stuff on any kind of a scale. Don't despair yet. We've just done all the crap stuff so far. Actually, we've barely done any of the good, ambitious, purposeful stuff we need to do. Let's just give that a go for a while and then tell me that you've got no hope.
Rob Hopkins, that was an immense pleasure. Thank you very much. I promised the audience that after you was Noémie Cheval from the local transition movement. But at the last minute, she could not come, so I'm not lying to the audience.
No, it's entirely truthful, listeners.
Yeah, thank you very much. But we have someone else here who can say a word about what projects are actually putting in place.
Should we swap?
Yeah, you can swatch, and they are inspired by you. Thank you very, very much, Rob.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Okay. Ouais. Alors, on va parler en français. We're going to switch to French. Sorry for English speaker, but the French speaker, we're talking about local projects, so I don't see the point of continuing in English. Salut.
Salut Antoine.
Ça va?
Oui.
Merci. Alors du coup, je t'ai pas introduit, je n'ai pas dit qui tu es. Alors je te laisse commencer par dire un petit peu qui tu es toi, quelle place tu as dans ce groupe comment ça s'appelle? Réseau Transition
Suisse romande.
Suisse romande, voilà.
Voilà, donc Muriel Rémy. Moi, je suis bénévole dans le réseau, je fais un peu comme toi. J'essaie de faire ma part et si je viens ici aussi, c'est quelque part, on a besoin de sous pour cette transition. C'est le nerf de la guerre. Comment est-ce qu'on va financer cette transition?
On en parlait tout à l'heure, du bénévolat tout le temps, ça épuise. Et puis,
ça épuise et le réseau transition, il travaille vraiment là-dedans. Comment soutenir ces gens? Donc, nous soutenir nous-mêmes et continuer et surtout trouver des nouvelles manières d'agir ensemble, travailler ensemble. Intervenir après Rob, c'est difficile parce qu'il a déjà tout dit.
C'est vrai, c'est un peu ça, mettre sur le grill comme ça.
Mais c'est exactement ça, c'est comment on travaille ensemble. Comment on sort de ce paradigme compétition, concurrence, ego.
De l'ego aussi, les habitudes de l'ego.
Et certainement que tu sais mieux que moi. Qu'est-ce que tu fais dans ton projet à Morges?
Alors, à Morges, beaucoup de choses, parce qu'en fait, si tu veux, moi, j'ai plutôt organisé la plateforme qui permet, ou le terreau qui permet aux graines, si on peut le voir comme ça, de grandir. Mais après, c'est les gens qui veulent s'engager, qui vont décider s'ils veulent plutôt organiser des nettoyages de rivières, ou s'ils veulent plutôt faire du lobbying auprès des politiciens, ou s'ils veulent plutôt avoir une coopérative d'habitation participative partagée, ou un jardin, parce que voilà. Donc, après, moi, les idées m'importent peu à partir du moment où les gens se mettent ensemble, parce qu'à mon avis, c'est ça qui engendrera réellement le changement, c'est quand les gens comprendront qu'ensemble, ils peuvent avoir la force de faire quelque chose qu'ils pensaient impossible, en fait. Et puis pour l'instant, on délègue. On dit c'est les autorités qui doivent faire. Alors on a oublié qu'en fait, on peut faire beaucoup de choses. Mais ça, c'est aussi une partie de l'imaginaire qu'on a perdu.
Et des peurs, hein, des habitudes,
Clairement.
de se sentir petit et impuissant. Et il y a un terme qui est un peu à la mode en ce moment, c'est l'éco-anxiété. Et c'est
Oui.
vraiment ça qu'on ressent beaucoup dans nos milieux. C'est mais on fait quoi avec tout ça? Comment on continue? Et surtout de ne pas se sentir impuissant. Et pour revenir à ce que fait le réseau Transition, c'est là où on aimerait agir, quoi. C'est dans la formation, c'est dans l'encouragement, c'est dans... tu as nommé Noémie Cheval et Martin, par exemple, Martin Gunn. Ils sont formateurs, donc ils essaient vraiment de proposer des formations. Il y a aussi Sylvie Ayeriongo qui propose des formations dans l'idée comment on travaille ensemble, comment avoir des groupes agréables et qui tiennent sur le long terme et où tout le monde a la parole. Donc, et où toutes les idées des gens sont bienvenues et comment on les amène sur le terrain, comment ça va devenir réalité. Et ça demande énormément de sortir de nos habitudes, de sortir de nos schémas. On doit me dire ce que je dois faire.
Oui, c'est tout un monde à réapprendre.
Ouais. Donc, il y a énormément de pédagogie, il y a énormément de... Et aussi, Rob l'a beaucoup mentionné, de inner transition, donc la transition intérieure.
Oui.
On ne pourra jamais voir advenir à l'extérieur ce qu'on n'a pas ressenti à l'intérieur.
Ouais.
Et on est beaucoup dans ces dualités. Moi, la nature, ça ne fait pas partie de moi. On l'exploite, du coup, on peut l'exploiter, les ressources. On peut exploiter les ressources des autres personnes.
Ouais. Va un peu plus près du micro.
Oui.
Prends-le, bouge-le comme ça.
Je le bouge.
Sens-toi vraiment
Excuse-moi.
free. Non, pas de souci.
Et voilà, donc on travaille sur toutes ces dimensions. Transition intérieure. On travaille énormément avec le travail qui relie, si tu connais ces notions de
c'est un peu
John
comme
Macy.
l'éco-psychologie, c'est ça?
Deep ecology, éco-psychologie. Aller sentir la nature, aller sentir qu'on est parti de la nature, se reconnecter du sens à ce qu'on aime, on va le protéger, ou en tout cas... Mais tu vois, même là, on est de nouveau dans des séparations.
Des concepts,
bien
sûr.
Mais voilà, donc c'est... Donc voilà, et l'idée, c'est aussi bien sûr de faire venir Rob Hopkins, de faire connaître son travail.
Voilà,
et
c'est beau d'ailleurs. Je
ouais.
remercie d'ailleurs le réseau en transition suisse romande pour avoir organisé ça, sans quoi Rob n'aurait pas pu être devant moi, nous, ce matin.
Voilà.
Donc merci beaucoup.
Mais avec grand plaisir. Et du coup, on a beaucoup appris parce qu'on est tous novices là.
Ouais.
Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire d'accompagner, de faire venir Rob en Suisse et surtout de le faire connaître à la population. Et donc, il a visité énormément de projets. Les gens sont venus à lui pour le montrer. Donc, hier, par exemple, on était à Lausanne, dans les rues de Lausanne. Il y a des projets dingues.
Ouais, vas-y, raconte.
Malheureusement, je ne me rappelle plus les noms. C'est horrible.
Ah oui, mais le contenu, le nom n'est pas...
Oui, mais du coup, il y a énormément de projets citoyens qui se sont vraiment mobilisés. En ce moment, c'est vraiment débitumé. Débitumé, ouais. Reverdir les feuilles, reverdir. Créer du faire ensemble. Il y avait des couturières qui ont ouvert grâce donc à des dons de la ville forcément, parce que ça coûte très cher en Suisse, donc il faut énormément d'argent public. Et c'est là aussi, il faut absolument qu'on se montre, qu'on soit courageux. On a besoin d'argent, donnez-nous, parce que ce qu'on fait, ça vaut la peine. Et ces citoyens, ils ont soulevé des montagnes, ils ont enlevé des places de parc, il y a des arbres, il y a des places de jeu, il y a des enfants qui jouent.
Mais c'est peut-être ça le danger, en fait, c'est parce qu'il y a beaucoup de gens qui font beaucoup de choses gratuitement, qui soulèvent des montagnes littéralement. Alors du coup, les autorités disent pourquoi on investirait? Il semblerait que ça marche un peu, mais le truc, c'est qu'on pourrait changer d'échelle et puis renverser pour le coup.
Et changer d'échelle, c'est vraiment notre défi.
Ouais, c'est ça.
Et si je me permets de faire un peu de pub, donc du coup, on fait
t'es là pour ça, on est d'accord.
Un financement participatif citoyen. Donc, sur notre page internet, on fait un We Make It. Et c'est vraiment là, on a vraiment de sous. Parce que nous, ce qu'on veut, c'est changer d'échelle, c'est le terme. Et c'est aller parler aux municipalités, c'est faire discuter des publics qui n'ont pas l'habitude de se rencontrer. Tu parlais d'inclusivité, d'entre nous, mais on le vit. On le vit vraiment. Donc, comment aller... On veut former beaucoup plus de monde. On aimerait monter beaucoup plus d'initiatives ou soutenir celles qui existent déjà pour qu'elles grandissent. Bon, on pourrait jouer sur le terme croissance, c'est peut-être un peu contradictoire, mais on veut croître avec moins. Faut peut-être réinventer un terme.
Voilà. Non, mais la croissance en général, on parle de décroissance, on parle de l'économie, pas forcément des projets qui amène une plus-value, du lien et autre chose que juste du bénéfice et du PIB, on est d'accord. Mais effectivement, il peut y avoir une confusion sur le mot. Et puis, décolonisant l'imaginaire, ça c'est Serre de la Touche, une référence en français, je ne l'ai pas donnée avant, mais c'est aussi un travail qui existe chez nous de vraiment se dire, mais et si tout ce qu'on avait toujours pensé, ça pouvait être autrement, quoi. Et donc, c'est un peu ce que vous faites, vous employez à faire avec... Et puis, après, au-delà des formations que vous donnez, vous êtes en lien avec ces groupes que tu as parlé, par exemple les couturières ou d'autres choses. Quelle est un petit peu la plus-value que quelqu'un qui lancerait un projet chez lui, près de chez lui, dans son quartier, comment il pourrait finalement voir une aide ou une coopération avec le réseau en transition suisse-romande?
On essaie déjà de maintenir à jour une carte, donc vraiment montrer concrètement, localement, qui fait quoi dans plusieurs domaines. Donc on est beaucoup dans les énergies, l'alimentation, de faire justement donc l'artisanat, la pédagogie. L'économie, on a un peu plus de peine, mais beaucoup plus dans les monnaies alternatives. Tu connais un peu le mouvement, relocaliser l'économie et que l'argent reste là et maintenant, donc on peut
il y a un CEL à Lausanne, système d'échange local,
ça c'est encore une autre dimension.
Ça, c'est encore autre chose.
Je voulais peut-être mentionner, par exemple, tu vois, les monnaies l'aimant.
Ah
on en avait une à moi, je sais pas.
Non, on n'en a pas encore, mais peut-être un jour.
Dans l'idée que l'argent ne part pas faire 10 fois le tour de la Terre, mais reste ici. Et on peut parler, par exemple, Rob a beaucoup mentionné, il faut des emplois, parce que sinon, ça va rester à la marge. Et c'est là que on aimerait sortir de la marge. Tous ces initiatives sont magnifiques, mais ça reste toujours une alternative à un système tellement grand.
Oui, c'est tout à fait marginal.
Tout à fait marginal, et c'est ça qui pourrait nous faire baisser les bras ou fatiguer parce qu'on reste à la marge.
C'est souvent le cas quand on regarde les projets. Au bout d'un moment, il y en a beaucoup qui périclitent parce que portés par peu de nombre. Et puis au bout d'un moment, on voit bien que les résultats...
Donc nous, ce qu'on vit maintenant avec Rob et avec le Tour, c'est qu'on voit à quel point les gens ont soif d'être connectés, ont envie de s'investir et d'être reconnus et de dire nous, on fait notre part. Et on a rencontré des gens incroyables, des personnes qui ont des projets fantastiques, et c'est là où on va mettre notre énergie maintenant. C'est les rendre visibles, les rendre, ou en tout cas documenter, montrer, et dans l'idée d'inspirer. Inspirer, encourager, et c'est faisable. Dites-nous que c'est pas faisable quand il y a tout ça.
Exactement.
Dites-nous que c'est pas faisable.
Donc en tout cas, on perd pas l'optimisme. Et du coup, vous pourrez m'aider aussi. Petit coup de pub aussi. J'ai fondé une nouvelle association récemment qui s'appelle les Artisans du commun. Et puis nous, on veut faire émerger des épiceries participatives citoyennes. Et là, hier soir, on avait une séance d'information. On était à Chailly. Bientôt, on sera à Morges. Et puis on va en faire un petit peu partout. Là, on pense que c'est possible. Il faut qu'on mette un petit bassin de population. Et puis, comme on est expérimenté dans l'ouverture de ce genre d'épicerie, on va équiper et puis surtout créer du lien entre les gens qui voient qu'il y a bien un travail à faire et qui veulent s'en donner un peu les moyens pour faire émerger un peu comme vous. Donc, on est un peu... il y a beaucoup de coordination et de partenariat et d'échanges qu'on peut faire. J'ai l'impression que ça pousse un peu portant. Exactement. C'est un peu le challenge d'ailleurs. De lier en fait toutes ces petites choses qui poussent à droite à gauche pour en faire une vraie force. Enfin, c'est comme ça que je vois les choses.
C'est vraiment ça. Je rebondis sur ce que tu disais, de ne pas attendre que ce soit les autres qui le fassent. Remontons les manches, mettons-nous ensemble. Et tout ce qu'on voit autour de nous, il y a énormément de choses qui marchent. Donc allons-y.
Exactement. Les prochaines dates, du coup, là, le tour, il n'est pas fini parce que Rob, il est arrivé en Suisse il n'y a pas longtemps, mais j'ai l'impression que son agenda, effectivement, et le vôtre, du coup, est très chargé. Mais du coup, pour peut-être ceux qui écoutent, donner les dates du tour en l'occurrence, et puis peut-être les prochaines choses très concrètes que vous allez mettre en place.
Donc, Rob et le réseau Transition seront à l'Alternativa le samedi 3 septembre, toute la journée. Donc, venez nous voir, c'est informel. Il y aura aussi un atelier participatif pour comment créer du nous avec toutes les luttes, les convergences des luttes, toutes les luttes qui seront là, sur place, que ce soit féministes, écologistes, solidaires, justice sociale et climatique pour tous. Et à mardi, Rob est à Yverdon-les-Bains avec nous et avec un magnifique projet, donc Yverdon Transition. Et il y a toute la journée un programme avec une rencontre avec toutes les associations sur le bassin autour d'Yverdon. Et le soir, une conférence ouverte au public.
Celle de Lausanne a eu un grand succès.
Ouais. Et ben, Yverdon, c'est encore 400 places de plus, donc on espère remplir.
Ah ouais. Je connais des gens qui vont venir à Yverdon parce qu'ils étaient déçus, parce qu'ils ne pouvaient pas. Bon.
Voilà, espérons.
Et je le recommande à tout le monde parce que c'est vraiment des ateliers où t'arrêtes un peu de dire oui, mais, et puis ça change direct, quoi. Ça
on doit beaucoup s'entraîner. Moi, j'ai encore la tendance.
Ah ouais, alors, une tendance bien ancrée, c'est sûr. C'est après un travail du quotidien.
Et juste de savoir que ça change tout. Parfois, juste de mettre de la conscience là, ça donne déjà une autre saveur aux choses. Et aux échanges et au dialogue.
Ouais, tout à fait. Pour un point technique, là, je suis désolé, mais c'est un problème que j'ai depuis que je fais ce podcast, c'est qu'il y a un décalage entre le son et l'image, encore. Bon, alors, comment
on est sur la Lune.
On est un peu sur la Lune. Alors, je sais pas pourquoi ça fait ça, mais promis, je vais m'y atteler encore, mais j'ai pas forcément les compétences, donc ça me prend du temps. Voilà, je voulais juste m'excuser pour ça. Vous pouvez écouter en audio aussi, c'est possible sur Spotify, voilà, si besoin. C'était une petite note parce que ça m'embête toujours de ne pas faire un truc parfait. Et je vois quand tu parles t'es décalé, ça devait être la même chose pour Rob tout à l'heure. Mais bon, ma foi, c'est comme ça. Avec les moyens du bord aussi, on fait du mieux qu'on peut. Merci beaucoup, Mireille. Tu veux encore ajouter quelque chose?
Non, je voulais te donner le stickers SI.
Merci pour stickers SI, que je ne mettrai pas sur mon 4x4 parce que j'en ai pas. Mais SI, et c'est bien de s'en rappeler tout le temps. SI plutôt que...
Devenons de bons compteurs du futur.
Ouais, exactement.
Et, comme disait Rob, on ne peut pas aller là vers là où ce qu'on n'a pas rêvé, ce qu'on n'a pas imaginé. J'aimerais sortir un petit peu de cette caricature du naïf qui rêve et de dire non, allons-y.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci à toi.
Bonne continuation et à bientôt.
À bientôt.
Ciao.